I think like so many things in American history, you start with Ben Franklin. I mean, he was core to establishing really the image of America in the world and was our first accredited diplomat and was the only man present at the four major turning points of the early republic: the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, the treaty that created an alliance with France during the Revolutionary War, and then the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War with Great Britain. So he's just a pivotal member, and he started in 1754 in London as a representative of Pennsylvania, as a perfectly loyal subject of the king, and evolved through that next period of years into America's leading diplomat and obviously a proponent of independence. And so he came back home for a bit, and then he was sent back over to Europe, now into France, where he'd visited twice before, with probably the most important diplomatic mission ever given an American diplomat, because absent some external support in a significant way, an overt way in the end from France, America would just never most likely have won its independence. His job in going over there was to gain support from France, both financial and if possible military. And the disadvantage he faced obviously was that France was a royalty, that the French had an innate suspicion of this new system of government, this revolution in human affairs that America represented. So Franklin went over, and his first major victory was actually in just capturing the French imagination. And he became the most popular, sort of the rock star of the times throughout France. He got his picture on teacups and establishes trends in clothing, and it was this combination of this image that he created, plus the realistic power politics that he offered the French in terms of countering Great Britain at the time and weakening their great rival across the English Channel. So he was there for a couple of years there, and the French actually covertly had money going to the Americans. But it wasn't until the military victory at Saratoga that the French were willing for the first time now to actually overtly negotiate and sign formal agreements with the Americans, which I think very early on, like so many patterns in American history, this establishes this relationship, I think, between diplomacy and the other enabling circumstances that go in concert with our diplomatic efforts, whether it's economic or military, informational. It's all part of a range of instruments of power that have to be orchestrated, and often that's the role of diplomacy, as it was with Franklin. So these treaties that he signed were absolutely pivotal and led then to a quieter, more covert but very significant amount of support by Spain, which was again allied with France or associated with France, and equally willing to undercut the British in the power politics of Europe at the time. The support of France is pretty well known. Lafayette and the fleet that closed off Yorktown and that kind of thing, but the Spanish support is much less known, and that was kind of an indirect effect of Franklin's work in Paris. So that created this pivotal change in the material circumstance of the revolution and set the stage then for his next major contribution, which is to be on the negotiating team that negotiated the Treaty of Paris ending the Revolutionary War, which is, if anything, even a more remarkable story. He's there with a negotiating team. John Adams was there as a team of three, and again, trying first of all to get the English to recognize the Americans as an independent state, and trying to kind of grow away from this entire dependence that at the time the colonies had on France for the material support. So it's kind of a triangular diplomatic game that Franklin is playing, fully knowing that he's being spied on by both sides and using that knowledge to make sure that both sides know that he's treating with the other, and that way gaining leverage on each. It's triangular diplomacy of a really classic type back in the early 1780s, which was in the end successful. The other interesting thing, and again a kind of a pattern that accompanies diplomacy through the ages, is that the secretary for the delegation, a guy named Bancroft, was in the pay of the English, and everything that Franklin and John Adams and those guys said, all the correspondence they had back with the back with the State Department. All of that was going straight to London. And he was also, by the way, speculating in the markets over there based on the information he was getting. So just hugely complex situation. And again, it took someone of Franklin's, I think, his personality, his ability, again, to project an image, to actually see to the core of the objectives of the English and the French to work into this interstice where America needed to be. And so, again, as I said at the outset, so many patterns of American diplomacy go straight back to Ben Franklin. So we get to the next, I think, major turning point, which would probably be the Louisiana Purchase. And again, that took advantage, like these earlier examples that I've spoken of this interplay among the power politics in Europe. I mean, the Spaniards had occupied and owned that region until basically the decline of Spain, and they handed it over to France. You got to remember how important New Orleans was to the new nation. I mean, all of the trade from the Midwest that was so vital to the growth and the long-term unity of the country flowed through New Orleans. And if you could cut that off, you create all kinds of economic and diplomatic and political complications for this brand new, very fragile nation. And so it was imperative then that the United States control the mouth of the Mississippi. And what is really miraculous about that time is that we reach this point where the Spaniards have transferred New Orleans and Louisiana, in fact, to the French. Bonaparte initially had hoped to establish control over that vast region, and certainly over New Orleans, but had lost an army in an earlier campaign in Hispaniola to malaria, and his fleet, of course, in that era would be unable to maintain contact between France and this new area under French control, given the Royal Navy patrolling the Atlantic. So Napoleon reached a conclusion that he needed to sell the land to America along with New Orleans, the entire stretch of land beyond New Orleans. And that, of course, fed in perfectly with America's objectives. In the long run, the original objectives of Livingston and the negotiating team were to buy New Orleans, but obviously when this wonderful offer fell in their lap, it was fairly self-evident what needed to be done. And in fact, it only took about 2.5 weeks for the negotiations to proceed. And when you look at most diplomatic negotiations, particularly for something of this scale, and that's just unbelievable. It was a characteristic of diplomacy at that time that the time for dispatches to get back and forth across the Atlantic was not only slow, it was very erratic. I mean, if it had been slow but predictable, it would be one thing, but it was slow and unpredictable, even to the extent of whether the dispatches would get there at all. And so you have kind of a different culture in the Foreign Service at the time of independent decision-making just because you had to. And this was a case where Livingston had been the Secretary of State under the Articles of Confederation for several years, and so he was an experienced diplomat. He knew the broad-scale strategy of this new republic and recognized an opportunity certainly when he saw it. And then, more or less by chance, Jefferson had sent James Monroe over to negotiate this treaty. And Monroe arrived the day after Talleyrand had made this offer to sell all of Louisiana along with New Orleans to Livingston. So the two of them were there together, and so they were able to have a pretty sure understanding of what Jefferson would want and proceed on that basis. I think the miracle is this confluence of events within France, actually, that led their objectives and America's to be so closely aligned and make this purchase so logical and readily available for both sides. And the other point that I would make about this incident is that school children all are taught about the Louisiana Purchase and what it did for America, this huge expanse in the extent of the nation. But it's also important to understand what it prevented for the nation, because if we hadn't been able to buy New Orleans, to attain control of the mouth of the Mississippi from France, we were going to have to establish some kind of alliance relationship with Great Britain. And that would have gotten us thoroughly tangled up in in the European power politics of the time, which was something that as a weak fledgling nation we just couldn't afford. And so that's a pathway that we were not forced to follow because of this good fortune that we had. Well, mostly a very small cadre, first of all. I mean, our diplomatic representation when Jefferson became the first Secretary of State was basically 2 diplomatic posts, one in London and one in Paris, and then 5 consulates. So our presence abroad was so limited, and it grew at a measured pace after that, but there was no formal training, there was no particular background, except people were trusted through their relationships and their work back here. John Adams, for example, went over to join the negotiating team in Paris to try to negotiate an end to the war with Great Britain, not based on any training. Lord knows he wasn't much of a diplomat by personality, but he was a strong, articulate, thoughtful, powerful advocate for the new country, and was sent over on that basis. And after that, he went up actually to Holland to negotiate financial support, a series of loans for the new country, and then he ended up finally on this negotiating team, negotiating the Treaty of Paris, back working with Franklin again. And the 2 of them were sort of the odd couple of American diplomacy in that era. You could hardly get 2 more different personalities than I think John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. I've not articulated any of this before, but what you had then is this moment of extreme peril in the nation. Obviously, the greatest threat that's existed to these United States since the Revolutionary era that we were just speaking of. And we had Abraham Lincoln in, obviously with no diplomatic background or experience in foreign relations, whatever. And he brings in William Seward as the Secretary of State, who, again, as fairly widely known, thought that he should have been president and that he would in fact be the policy leader for this administration. And that was fairly quickly disabused during the first months of his tenure as Secretary of State, but it was a fairly rocky passage. And the strategic task then for America was most of all to keep Europe out of the war, and the pivot point there was our embassy in London. And Charles Francis Adams, who again goes back through the Adams family, who was John Quincy Adams' son, grandson of John Adams. So this line of diplomats out of the Adams family ends up again being pivotal to the salvation of the Union in this time of crisis, because you've got the Confederates who have this wonderful economic weapon of cotton that they think will compel Great Britain to open up the blockade that the Union had established on the South and establish diplomatic and trade relations with the Confederacy just to keep the people at work in Birmingham and to support the economy and in fact extend that all the way to political stability within Great Britain. So this was a very, very high stakes game. And the disadvantage actually that the South had, I think most prominently, was first of all, the English leadership had no real desire to go to war with anybody at the time over any of the stakes that were at play. But there was also slavery, which again, the English people were very much cognizant of that difference between the Confederacy and the Union, and very reluctant to support the slave economy of the South. But it was a close-cut thing over time because, again, these economic pressures began to play on Great Britain. So you've got these interests at play within Great Britain. You've got sort of what are their strategic and political objectives, and you've got this huge economic weapon that they fear will be wielded by the South with huge political and domestic impact for the British. And so you had this very active campaign by both sides, both the Union and the Confederacy, to maintain a diplomatic presence in Great Britain and secondarily in France, but also to a huge public diplomacy aspect of this war to make sure that the English people writ large, up through the ruling classes, understand exactly what's at stake here, both in terms of the difference in the societies of the two nations as they were constituted. The Confederacy, I'll probably get in trouble for calling the Confederacy a nation because Lincoln never did, but in any case, to actually feed information into the press, op-eds, articles, buying off journalists. It's this wonderful story of this competition for public opinion all the way back during the Civil War, which was so important. And the other aspect of it was this attempt by the Union to cut off the arms sales to the Confederacy and this blockade running. And so what also develops along with this high-level diplomacy, then you've got the war for public opinion, and at a layer below that, you've got this really surreptitious but very, very active campaign by the Union to keep track of who's buying what arms and how are they getting to the South, and also to prevent the English from permitting the construction of blockade runners and ships capable of preying on Union commerce. So all of this is just this imbroglio that's going on for years and years and years within Great Britain. And in the end, the effort of Secretary Seward, Charles Francis Adams, in maintaining the understanding of the leaders of Great Britain that it would be casus belli for them to intervene in this war. I mean, it was a kind of a dual-edged public image of the United States on the one side, but on the other, you need to understand the stakes at play if you interfere in this conflict. And that was a huge victory for diplomacy, again, at a pivotal moment in American history. Well, first of all, Carr was the third of three people who had roughly analogous roles within the bureaucracy of the State Department. And it's just a really remarkable story that begins, I think, about 1820 and extends up through Carr, who finally retires, I think, in 1938. His last job in the State Department was ambassador to Czechoslovakia, believe it or not, when the Munich Agreement was signed. So went out on a kind of a low note, I would say. But for most of his career, he was the bureaucratic center of gravity of the State Department. He was the guy actually maintaining an orderly system of records and sound management within the department. And as part of that, he kept assuming to himself or being assigned greater and greater levels of responsibility until he became the director of the consular service, a uniformly competent, systematic, orderly worker. He loved order and method, and he was appointed to direct the consular service, and it was actually there first that these reforms really took root in terms of sort of the normalization of fees and creating kind of a professional basis for the consular service, which was then kind of brought into this larger whole in the aftermath of World War I, which again is a huge era for American diplomacy. I mean, it's kind of an unfortunate truth that conflict always brings out kind of an expansion in the general authorities and reach of government, but never more so than in the world of diplomacy. In the case of World War I, the most remarkable story. I mean, we become the leading neutral in that era. So when war breaks out, for example, in between France and Germany, we would represent, as an example, France within Germany, because they had broken diplomatic relations, and we would pick up sort of this care of French citizens in that context. An even bigger story actually is in Paris itself during the First World War, when the entire economic system, financial system in France basically broke down, and they nationalized the transportation system, and we at our embassy were required to get shipments of gold arranged back from Washington, and Wilbur Carr did exactly that. He was a guy working that at this end of the problem to get over there so that American citizens would be able to pay their way out of the country. It's just a remarkable thing, and a very major moment for the department, which entered that conflict with this sort of a very kind of low-op tempo 19th century bureaucracy, and all of a sudden there's this deluge of activity that they're forced to respond to. And I think that's part of the impetus towards the Rogers Act, is just understanding that you need to modernize, normalize, and professionalize the Foreign Service as a basis for American diplomacy, and that's really what it did. And Wilbur Carr was sort of the driving engine in creating that and going back to Congress actually a couple times to see it passed. Well, they actually, I mean, the downside of the story is, which I hope doesn't appear on film, but actually this does become one large service. Actually, the consular and foreign services are kind of merged, and then it becomes a competition for the promotion boards to see who gets promoted, and the consular service just lost out big time. They actually had to go back and, I think, re-legislate the promotion system under this new merged foreign service. I think the biggest thing is that it created a statutory basis for the professionalization, kind of the orderly selection and institution of new foreign service officers, a promotion system that made sense, and a pay system that sort of went along with this general professionalization. All the essentials of organization are set there. And it's been, obviously, as America's role in the world has evolved since then, in World War II and then in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and at various points since then, as America's reach has widened and as our role across the international system has intensified, this has stood us as an essential foundation for this growth in numbers, and also in the broadening aperture, as I call it, of foreign relations. You know, when you look back at the opening days of the Republic that we were just discussing, it's basically bilateral, and it's negotiating a treaty to end a war. And now when you look at what we do as members of the Foreign Service and as a department, the aperture is just so much broader because the complexity of the international system and the number of players and the issues that kind of fall within this purview of diplomacy now. None of that could have been adapted to, I think, without the Rogers Act. Yeah, that's certainly true. And it took a long time. It's always been a case, I think, historically speaking, where the requirements of the department are met after some time lag. And so you have these intervals, like at the end of the 19th century, it's become pretty clear that we need some kind of professionalization of the Foreign Service. But you need a trigger. You know, you need Congress to recognize this, you need the right advocate, you need the right conceptual framework to create so you can move ahead. And I think that's, all these things came together, as I said before, with Wilbur Carr, who was, again, kind of the conceptual architect of this legislation, and worked with Congress to get it passed. Yeah, it was an interesting thing because, of course, you come through the Second World War, and you have this trusted working relationship, I guess you would say, certainly across the public and within the policy community to a large extent, with the Soviet Union. And the Soviets, by the way, were very interested in cultivating that. They had their own very active public diplomacy program here in the United States. But in the aftermath of the war, actually starting with Poland during the war, it became clear that it was going to be very hard to reconcile their vision of the post-war world with American, let alone with Great Britain, which were the three major disputants in this situation. And over time, there is a series of crises as the shape of the post-war world gradually emerges. What you have then is this gradual accumulation of evidence that, you know, they see things differently than we do. They have a different culture, they have a different perception on the international system, and that this dream that we had of a United Nations with kind of this collegial relationship and a long-term stable relationship with the Soviet Union was just not going to happen. And the evidence was mounting and mounting and mounting, and people were thinking about it. They were thinking about it here, they were thinking about it in Great Britain and in the Soviet Union. There are actually sort of equivalent analyses that were done. But you need a trigger event, one great mind to kind of step back from the whole thing. And Kennan was an expert in the Soviet Union and in Russia, and a very, very thoughtful man, obviously, given the results of this effort. And so what we have then is this, it's almost like dropping something into a supersaturated solution. All the evidence was there. It was fairly clear that what they were trying to do wasn't working. And you drop in that little pebble and everything suddenly kind of clarifies and firms up. And that's, I think, more than anything, that was the role of the telegram.